Across the green hills and damp valleys of medieval Europe, it was common to find something eerie above the doorway of a peasant's cottage or a barn. A skull, bleached by sun and time, its hollow eyes staring out toward the road. To the modern observer, it looks like a grim trophy, a reminder of death. But to the people who lived beneath it, that bone was life itself, a silent guardian, a protector carved from nature's oldest armor. A cow's skull might hang over a stable door, its horns jutting proudly toward the fields. A horse's skull might crown a barn, its teeth grinning toward the wind. Even sheep and goats found their place above the lintels of humble cottages. The villagers didn't see them as macabre. They saw them as necessary. Every skull told a story of an animal that had served, of the land that had given, and of the unseen world that demanded constant respect. In a time when science had no name and faith was as fragile as it was fierce, the boundary between the living and the dead was thin. The world of medieval people was haunted, not in the modern sense of ghosts, but by invisible presences that shaped fortune and fate. Disease could strike without warning, storms could destroy in an hour, and crops could rot in the field. The skull was more than bone. It was a shield against chaos. The villagers believed that within every skull lingered the strength and spirit of the creature that once lived. Its shape, strong, unyielding, was thought to trap power, to hold the last echo of the beast's life force. When placed above a doorway, that strength became a sentry. Evil spirits, wandering souls, or malevolent eyes might approach, but the skull met them first, empty, watching, unflinching. To walk beneath such a symbol was to pass through a sacred threshold. The skull turned the act of entering a house into a ritual. It reminded those who stepped inside that this was a protected space, bound not just by wood and stone, but by belief and sacrifice. In villages where the nights were long and the forests whispered with old superstitions, such symbols offered comfort. They were promises in bone. You are safe here. But there was more beneath the surface, far older meanings buried in memory. The skulls spoke of an ancient pact between humankind and the natural world, a pact that long predated the church's cross or the scholar's pen. To hang an animal's head was to honor its spirit, to thank it for its service, and to ensure that its strength lived on, not as a ghost, but as a guardian. Travelers who passed through medieval hamlets often wrote of these strange decorations, sometimes calling them charms, other times relics of the heathen days. Yet even as Christianity spread, few dared remove them. Too many tales were told of those who mocked the old ways, of roofs that collapsed, milk that soured, or cattle that dropped dead in the field after a skull was taken down. To the peasants, it wasn't superstition. It was tradition, tested by generations of survival. A skull on a door wasn't a warning. It was a welcome to the living and to the unseen forces that watched over them. It was both a monument to what had been and a talisman for what was yet to come. And though centuries have passed, when we stand before the ruins of a medieval barn and see the faint marks of where a skull once hung, it's easy to feel that presence still, the ancient gaze that guarded homes when faith was made not of words, but of bone. Long before the cross ever touched a church steeple, people in Europe already hung bones on their doors. The custom stretched deep into pre-Christian soil, older than kings, older than written history. In those ancient days, the skull was not a token of death, but a vessel of power. It was the seat of the spirit, the place where breath, thought, and strength once lived. And though the animal's body perished, its skull remained, heavy with invisible energy. Early farmers believed the spirit of the animal lingered within its bones, especially the head, which saw, breathed, and ate the trinity of life itself. To display it was not to boast of a kill, but to honor a sacrifice. When a cow or goat was slaughtered for food, the skull was preserved, cleaned, and placed above the door as a way of thanking the creature for its service. The gesture promised a form of resurrection, that its strength would live on, guarding those who had once cared for it. These practices were not born from cruelty, but reverence. Pagan Europe saw no division between the sacred and the natural. Life and death were not opposites. They were partners in an eternal exchange. Hanging a skull on a cottage was, in essence, a prayer. A hope that the fertility and vigor of the animal would transfer to the home, the land, and the people who dwelled there. The skull became a charm for abundance, its hollow eyes watching over crops, its silent mouth swallowing misfortune. Every region had its own variations. In the misty isles of the North Atlantic, fishermen hung the skulls of sea creatures near their huts to appease the spirits of the water. In the Slavic forests, hunters placed the antlered heads of stags on their walls as tributes to the wild gods. In Celtic lands, ox skulls were buried beneath thresholds, the horns pointing inward, symbols of protection and prosperity. Everywhere, bone was both weapon and offering. When Christianity spread through Europe, it met these traditions with suspicion, but also with recognition. The new faith could not simply erase the old reverence for the animal world. Instead, it absorbed it. The skulls that once invoked the gods of earth and sky now quietly guarded in the name of Saint Cuthbert or Saint Brigid. The meaning shifted, but the habit endured. By the time of the High Middle Ages, the skull above the door had become a blend of superstition and sanctity. It no longer spoke to pagan gods, but to the Christian soul that feared the devil's envy and the witch's curse. The villagers might sprinkle holy water on it at Easter or decorate it with flowers at harvest time. They might even carve a cross into the forehead bone, an uneasy marriage between faiths. Yet the true belief beneath it all remained the same, that life and spirit were eternal, and that power, once given, could still protect. So when travelers passed through villages at dusk and saw the skulls gleaming pale in torchlight, they were not seeing symbols of death. They were witnessing a covenant, the quiet continuation of a bond between humankind and the wild. To the people of that world, the skull was proof that everything in nature, even in death, had purpose. And so the bones hung on, season after season, through snow and sun and storm, whispering of the old world that still lived beneath the new. To truly understand why medieval people hung skulls on their doors, one must understand what a door meant to them. In our world, a door is a boundary of privacy, a thing we open and close without thought. But in the Middle Ages, a doorway was far more than an entrance. It was a frontier between two worlds, the safety of the hearth within and the unpredictable wilderness beyond. The threshold was sacred. It marked the line between chaos and order, between what belonged to man and what belonged to the spirits. Crossing it was never casual. It was symbolic, even dangerous. A door could keep out wind, rain, or thieves, but it could not stop what was unseen. To guard against such forces, people did not rely on locks. They relied on ritual. Every culture across medieval Europe shared this same anxiety about thresholds. Evil spirits, it was said, traveled with the wind or clung to shadows. They could slip into homes through cracks, keyholes, or even under the door itself. Disease, misfortune, envy, all were thought to flow through invisible channels, seeking weak or unguarded places. The door, being the most obvious passage, became both a symbol of welcome and a target of attack. So, the villagers fought back, with symbols, prayers, and bones. A skull hung above the door was not merely decoration, it was an eye that never closed. Its hollow sockets were thought to see what human eyes could not. When spirits approached, they would see the gaze of another, a guardian that had already crossed death's veil, and turn away. The skull also embodied one of the oldest ideas in folk belief, that what had touched death could repel death. It was the same logic that led people to hang iron horseshoes or nails near doors, or to bury the bones of animals beneath thresholds. Death, they reasoned, recognized its own and would pass over. The skull thus became both a warning and a shield, whispering to all who might approach. This home already knows death. You will find no prey here. It's no coincidence that doorways were also where many rituals began and ended. A newborn was sometimes carried across the threshold 3 times to ensure it would not be stolen by fairies. When someone died, the corpse was carried out feet first, so that its soul would not try to return. Even weddings and blessings were often held at the door, the spot where 2 realms met, the human and the divine. The skull fit perfectly within this cosmology. It stood as a sentinel, a relic, and a mediator, half of this world, half of the next. It wasn't simply a charm against evil. It was a sign that the people inside understood the balance of life and death. They lived in partnership with it, not in denial. Some skulls even bore markings, carved crosses, runic symbols, or spirals etched into the bone. These were not random designs. The spiral symbolized eternity. The cross united heaven and earth. Together with the skull, they formed a kind of door magic, a language of protection written in flesh and faith. So when you imagine that medieval cottage at dusk, its firelight flickering through cracks, remember this. The skull above the door wasn't there to frighten. It was there to speak. To the living, it said, "You are home." To the unseen, it warned, "Go no further." And in that silent exchange, between the world of light and the world of shadow, the medieval home found its fragile peace. Not every skull could guard a home. To the medieval mind, the power of protection depended on the animal itself, on what it represented, what it endured, and what it offered to human life. The skull was not chosen for shape or size, but for meaning. Every beast had its spirit, and that spirit, once bound to the home, would lend its strength to those within. The ox and the bull were among the most revered. Strong, enduring, and patient, they were creatures of the plow, the living engines of the medieval field. Their skulls, heavy and wide, spoke of stability and might. Hung above a doorway, they were meant to bring strength to the house's foundation, to make the family as unyielding as the beast that once broke the soil. Farmers believed the ox's spirit would protect their tools and keep the land fertile. It was not uncommon to find ox skulls whitened by weather over barn doors, their hollow eyes forever watching the crops they once helped grow. The horse's skull, by contrast, carried nobility and speed, the power to move between worlds. Horses were companions in war and work, symbols of vitality and courage. Their bones were said to carry a special energy, swift and restless. When placed on a roof or near a gate, a horse's skull was believed to keep wandering spirits at bay, confusing them with its hollow echoes. In parts of Britain and Scandinavia, it was even said that the sound of wind whistling through a horse's skull could repel evil, the animal's breath still alive in the air. Goat skulls were hung for fertility and fortune. Goats, creatures of stubborn resilience, symbolized independence and vigor. A goat skull near the door or garden was believed to bless the household with abundance, milk that would never sour, soil that would never sleep. Yet, they also carried darker associations. In Christian eyes, the goat's horns echoed the devil's own, so the sight of such a skull could spark both fear and respect. But to peasants, it was simple. Whatever frightened evil would drive it away. Sheep and ram skulls carried gentler meanings. They symbolized purity, faith, and sacrifice. In Christian symbolism, the lamb represented Christ, the innocent offering. But for common folk, it also represented endurance, the ability to survive harsh winters and hard labor. A ram's curved horns were seen as circles of eternity, a visual prayer that the family's line would continue unbroken. Even smaller animals played their roles. Bird skulls were sometimes hung near windows to keep away restless spirits, their hollow eyes said to see into other realms. Dog skulls, though rarer, guarded stables and barns. Dogs were the guardians of the living and the dead, loyal in both life and legend. To hang a dog's skull was to invite its eternal watchfulness. Each animal carried a part of the human story, the sweat, the fear, the companionship. And each skull was a reminder that survival in the Middle Ages was not solitary. It was shared between man and beast, earth and spirit. To the medieval villager, a skull was never just a relic. It was a conversation frozen in bone, a promise that the life given would continue to serve, not as flesh, but as force. So the cottages stood beneath their pale sentinels, oxen guarding strength, horses guarding speed, goats guarding fortune. The wind would moan through hollow skulls on winter nights, and villagers would listen, comforted by the sound. To them, it was not eerie. It was alive. The breath of the animal world still moving, still protecting, even in death. In a time when the living and the dead were neighbors, these bones were bridges, silent, sacred, and steadfast. The act of hanging a skull was not a casual gesture. It was ritual, a slow, deliberate act that bound the living to the spirit world. Every movement, every word spoken, mattered. For the medieval villager, to mount a skull on one's home was to invite protection, not demand it. It had to be done respectfully, or the spirit of the animal might grow restless, even angry. The ritual usually began at dusk, the time when day and night met, when, as people said, the worlds touched. The family would gather before the doorway or barn, and the head of the household, often the father or eldest son, would carry the skull wrapped in linen or straw. It was never taken with bare hands. Touching the skull directly before the blessing was considered impure, a sign of arrogance toward the dead. Sometimes a small fire was lit, fed with dried herbs like rosemary or juniper. The fragrant smoke was believed to cleanse both the space and the object. If the animal had recently died, a prayer was whispered, part Christian, part ancient charm. It might begin with, "In the name of the Father," but it would end with words that belonged to the land. "May your strength watch over this house, your eyes see what ours cannot, your spirit rest and guard us through the night." Then came the act itself. The skull was lifted to the doorway, often by two people, one standing on a stool while the other steadied the bone. The horns, if present, faced outward to ward off misfortune. If it was a sheep or ox skull, a sprig of green, a symbol of life, was placed in one eye socket. For horses, a small coin or piece of iron was slipped into the mouth, binding the spirit's power to the household's wealth or safety. No nail was ever hammered directly into the bone. That would wound it, the villagers believed, and spoil its strength. Instead, the skull was bound with cords of hemp or fastened between beams where the wind could reach it. Once it was secure, the fire's smoke was fanned upward, letting the fragrant air wash over the skull, sealing it into the house's spiritual frame. The ritual did not end there. For 3 nights, no one would sweep the doorway or pass through it after sunset. To do so risked disturbing the new guardian before it settled. A piece of bread or a splash of milk was left just inside the threshold each evening, offerings to welcome the spirit into its new duty. Over time, the skull became a familiar presence, weathering storms and seasons. Children might glance up at it before bed, whispering quick goodnights. Travelers might cross themselves upon seeing it, unsure whether it marked holiness or heresy. But to the villagers, it simply belonged. In some regions, this ceremony was tied to the rhythm of the year. New skulls were sometimes hung at harvest's end, after the first frost, the moment when the year died. Others preferred spring, when life returned to the land, believing the skull's blessing would rise with the season's new light. Whatever the time, the moment was always solemn, never a spectacle, never a joke. If misfortune later struck, a fire, a sickness, a poor harvest, the family might take down the skull, clean it with smoke or water from a church font, and hang it anew. They believed the skull's spirit had been disturbed and needed to be appeased, and when the day finally came to rebuild or move, the skull was never discarded. It was carried with reverence to the new home or buried near the threshold, face down, eyes to the earth, so it could continue to watch from below. To us, this might seem strange, even morbid, but to them, it was communion, an exchange of protection, respect, and memory. Because in a world where walls were thin and darkness had no mercy, a skull was more than a symbol. It was the line between ruin and refuge. By the late Middle Ages, the skulls above doors had become more than folk charms. They were symbols of an uneasy peace between two belief systems, the lingering pagan reverence for nature and the stern authority of the Christian Church. The peasants who hung them did not see contradiction. They lived in a world where faith was layered, not divided, where a blessing from the priest and a charm from the earth could coexist beneath the same roof. The Church, however, did not always agree. In many regions, priests frowned upon these heathen bones, warning that such acts bordered on idolatry. They preached that only the sign of the cross could protect a home, not the skull of a beast. Yet even among the clergy, superstition persisted. In monastic records from England and Bavaria, there are quiet notes of priests who, after scolding their flock for using animal charms, buried horse skulls under the church threshold to strengthen the voice of the bell or ward against storms. Faith, it seemed, had bones of its own. For the peasants, the skull's protection was never about rebellion. It was about survival. Disease, famine, and war visited them often, and they had few defenses against such forces. God ruled the heavens, yes, but the earth belonged to older powers. A skull was a whisper to both worlds. Watch over us, whoever listens. Some even believed the skulls could sense sin. A legend from rural France told of a shepherd who lied about a theft and found the ox skull above his barn, blackened by lightning the next morning. In another story from the Carpathians, a woman accused of witchcraft claimed innocence until her goat skull guardian cracked clean in half during a church procession. These tales reinforced a quiet moral code, that the skull was not merely a charm, but a judge, capable of revealing guilt or protecting purity. Despite church disapproval, the practice endured, often disguised under Christian symbols. Families carved small crosses into the skull's foreheads or painted them red with ochre, calling them holy protectors. During All Saints' Day, villagers might place candles near the door, letting the flames flicker against the bone as a tribute to ancestors and animals alike. The act was both prayer and memory, a recognition that life and death were bound by gratitude. Even nobility sometimes participated, though quietly. In certain manors, deer or boar skulls hung over gatehouses, trophies, yes, but also charms to protect their estates. Lords could call it decoration, their servants knew better. Beneath the antlers and gold, the same ancient logic persisted. The spirit that once guarded the forest now guards this home. By the 15th century, scholars began to write of these customs with both fascination and disdain. They called them relics of the old faith, evidence that peasants still clung to nature's magic even as cathedrals rose across Europe. But what those scholars failed to grasp was that the medieval soul did not separate the sacred from the natural. To them, the skull was not pagan or Christian, it was simply true. It represented continuity, the idea that nothing in creation truly ended. The animal's body fed the soil, its spirit guarded the living, and its bones told the story of that bond. When villagers looked upon those skulls each morning, they were reminded not of death, but of endurance, of the strength to wake again, to plant again, to live again. So, as bells rang for Mass and incense curled through the air, the skulls above the doors kept their silent vigil. They belonged to neither church nor myth, but to something older and humbler, the eternal instinct to protect what we love, by any means we understand. As centuries passed, the skulls that guarded medieval homes began to take on new meanings, their presence shifting from necessity to legend. In the quiet hours of night, when the wind blew through the thatched roofs, villagers would swear they could hear the skulls whisper. The hollow chambers of bone caught the air and gave it voice, moaning, humming, sometimes even whistling. And people believed it was the sound of spirits keeping watch. The wind was the skull's breath, a living proof that its soul had not departed. In coastal villages of northern Europe, where the gales howled fiercely, people said the skulls of oxen and horses sang to warn of storms. If the tone rose and fell like a human cry, it was an omen of bad weather, or worse, a death in the village. But if the sound was low and steady, it meant protection. The guardian was awake, fending off harm. Over time, the sound became part of the rhythm of life. Children grew up with it as a lullaby, the soft whistle of the wind through bone merging with the creak of wood and the rustle of straw. Old women told them that as long as the skull could sing, the household would never fall. Silence, on the other hand, was feared, a sign that the guardian spirit had faded or moved on. In such cases, the family might climb to the beam and feed the skull, rubbing it with animal fat, milk, or even ale to wake it once more. Travelers who passed through the countryside at night found these places eerie. Imagine walking through fog, hearing strange murmurs from every cottage, a chorus of breathless guardians whispering in the dark. To outsiders, it sounded like haunting. To those who lived there, it was comfort. The connection between wind and spirit was ancient. Across cultures, breath was life, the invisible bridge between the body and the divine. In Old English, the word gast meant both spirit and breath. In Latin, spiritus carried the same meaning. Thus, when the wind moved through the skull, it was believed the spirit was literally alive, still breathing, still guarding. In some regions, people even crafted wind skulls, hollowed horse skulls fixed deliberately to rafters or poles so that air could pass freely through their eye sockets. These were not just charms, but instruments, guardians that could speak. The eerie music they produced was thought to keep away witches and wandering souls. A German chronicler once wrote of a village where every house had a singing bone upon its roof, and the night air trembled with their voices like a choir of the dead. Even as literacy and logic spread, the villagers' belief endured. It wasn't about superstition anymore. It was about continuity. The skull had become a companion, its song a reminder that the house was never alone. And when storms lashed the countryside, when thunder shook the earth and lightning split the sky, people huddled by the fire, listening. The wind shrieked through the hollow guardians above, and they whispered back with gratitude, "They are protecting us still." Centuries later, when those cottages rotted and fell, some skulls were found among the ruins, worn smooth by rain, their edges hollowed like flutes. Even in silence, they seemed to hum with memory. Each one carried the echo of generations, the laughter, the prayers, the fears it had once sheltered. And though time has buried them, somewhere in those ancient bones the wind may still move, still sing, a faint, eternal breath from the world that never truly died. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the sight of animal skulls above medieval doorways began to fade. Stone replaced timber, slate replaced thatch, and with them, much of the old magic disappeared. The world was changing. Cities grew, scholars wrote of reason and science, and the church tightened its hold on the countryside. But the memory of the skulls, their gaze, their whisper, their protection, lingered long after the bones themselves had turned to dust. What had once been a living ritual became story. Grandparents told children of the bone watchers, spirits that guarded homes before locks and keys. In some places, the practice evolved rather than vanished. The skull gave way to the carved gargoyle, stone beasts that perched on cathedrals and castles, mouths open to the wind, eyes forever watching. Different material, same purpose. The belief that something non-human should guard the human heart never truly died. It only changed shape. Archaeologists in later centuries uncovered skulls beneath cottage foundations, placed deliberately under doorsteps or hearths. Many were dated to the 14th and 15th centuries, long after the church had declared such customs superstitious. Yet there they remained, a quiet rebellion against forgetting. These finds proved that for the common folk, faith was not a matter of doctrine, but of trust. Trust in what had kept their ancestors alive through plague, hunger, and fear. In some remote corners of Europe, the practice persisted even into the 18th century. Travelers through rural Ireland and the Baltic noted horse skulls buried beneath floors to bring sound to the house, a remnant of the belief that spirits breathed through bone. In the Scottish Highlands, shepherds still hung ram skulls at the entrance of sheepfolds, saying they kept the flock calm. The church called it pagan. The peasants called it tradition. To the modern eye, such customs seem strange, primitive, even macabre. But for the people of the Middle Ages, they were acts of reverence, not ignorance. A skull was a story in physical form, a reminder that life and death were not separate paths, but part of one endless circle. Where we might see only decay, they saw endurance, the proof that something which once lived could still protect. The deeper truth is this: medieval people were not obsessed with death. They were obsessed with balance. They lived close to the soil, close to their animals, close to the elements. They did not seek to conquer nature. They sought to live alongside it. Hanging a skull was an act of harmony, an acknowledgement that survival required partnership with the unseen. Even now, echoes of that instinct remain. We hang charms, we touch wood, we bless our homes. We light candles in memory of the dead, believing somehow that their warmth will return to us. The materials have changed. Gold instead of bone, glass instead of skull. But the purpose is the same: to keep the darkness out, to invite safety in. And perhaps that is why the image of a skull above a door still unsettles and fascinates us. It forces us to remember that our ancestors lived in a world where fear and faith were one, where a simple bone could stand between ruin and hope. Today, when we walk through the ruins of a medieval village and see a pale relic half buried in the soil, the curve of a horn, the hollow of an eye socket, we are not just looking at an artifact. We are looking at a guardian, a fragment of belief carved not by art, but by survival. For though centuries have passed, the truth remains. To the people of the Middle Ages, life was fragile, death was near, and protection came not from power, but from reverence. In the end, the skull above the door was never a symbol of death. It was the oldest prayer of all, carved in silence, held in bone, whispered to the wind. Watch over us.